Hey everybody, Nike here. With the X-Pack looming on the horizon, there is a major balance issue that I wanted to discuss that will have a huge impact on future Elite specs. Most of you can probably guess what that is, but I'll just come right out and say it, and it's Druid. To set the table a bit, Druid brings very strong offensive buffs. It brings essentially a 10% damage boost to the entire raid in the form of Grace of the Land, along with Spotter and Frost Spirit, which adds another 10% or so to the Druid sub-squad. If you get the Stun Spirit in the mix, you're even higher, along with whatever value you get from the other boons that Druids can optionally produce, like Fury, Might, Vigor, and Protection. The simple problem is Druid is so good that any future Elite spec based on healing will not be able to compare. Even with the 10-man Grace of the Land change, a second Druid still brings an average of about 1 extra Grace stack to an average raid squad, along with Spirits and Spotter to his sub-squad. So adding the second Druid is still a pretty big DPS increase for the whole raid, along with a pretty big DPS increase to his own sub-squad. That amount of buffing alone makes two Druids very valuable, and it's hard to envision another healing spec that brings that amount of party buffing without a large power creep. Part of the issue is that base ranger buffs like Spotter and Spirits are so good. They're good enough that even if Druid somehow became outclassed by a new spec, you would still want those buffs in your raid squad. Sure, a DPS Condi Ranger could bring them, but at a pretty large cost to his own personal DPS. Spotter is actually a tad overrated. In a full group of power classes, Spotter works out to be about a 2% DPS increase. This is nice, but it isn't a game changer. Especially in a full Condi sub-squad, Spotter is even less important. So I think in reality, Spotter isn't the game changer here, it's the Spirits. So with Grace of the Land and Spirits as the established balance issue, what are the main options that ANET could do to deal with it? The first option is obvious. Make Spirits also affect 10 players. If Spirits affect 10 players and Grace of the Land affects 10 players, it would make the second Druid in your group completely redundant, for the most part, once another healer class with a unique benefit exists. It would open the door for a new Elite spec that heals and brings some other nice buff. Essentially, in the future, you'd have one heal spot dedicated to your Druid, who has 10-man Grace and 10-man Spirits, and a flex heal spot dedicated to some new heal spec that also brings its own set of utility. Or perhaps even there would be a situation where you would prefer to run a 5-4-1 sub-squad layout with a single pure heal Druid and then an extra DPS. But at least there would be a slot for something else besides a second Druid. Unfortunately, that isn't a really good solution that simply kicks the can down the road. Assuming that this game still exists, what is the situation going to look like 3 expansion packs from now? If you have 10-man Spirits and 10-man Grace of the Land, you will still have a Druid in every raid group no matter what, no matter how many new heal specs come out, no matter how far into the future. Does that seem insanely bad to you, as it does to me? It seems to be a huge problem to have one Elite spec that is so over-the-top good that it has a 100% assured place in any meta, now and forever, absolutely regardless. In the short term, increasing Grace and Spirits to 10 players is a solution for freeing up a new spot for whatever new heal spec comes out in the X-Pack. In the long term, though, it means we'll always have a Druid, and only one free slot in the future for all the new specs to fight over. In my opinion, for the long-term good of the game, it would be best to have Spirits go to 10 players and then to nerf Grace of the Land severely. Almost nerfing it out of existence. I know this is a pretty radical opinion, but I think the only way to ever get parity with future healing specs is to nerf Grace of the Land to the point where people will still consider a Druid great, but not 100% mandatory. In a sense, it will create a situation similar to where Warriors are, where Spirits are the equivalent of Banners. Since they are base spec buff, it is conceivable that regardless of what new stuff comes out in an Elite spec, we'll always have a way to include a Ranger with Spirits in our comp, whether it be Druid, base Condi Ranger, or something new. In the case of Warrior, we only really need one Warrior for buffs. If a new elite spec came along that provided some useful buffs and also stacked good might, we could see a split with one Warrior and whatever the new thing is. The same would be true of Ranger, since it would get the most of its value from a core spec. So how should they nerf Grace of the Land? And the answer is, I'm not sure. Even if you nerfed it to 1% per stack, it's probably still good enough to warrant always bringing a Druid now and forever into the future. So that's probably not enough. I would suggest changing it to a non-unique buff like Boons, or even a redundant existing unique buff like Alacrity. Again, the goal here is to keep Druid as a viable healing spec, which it would always be thanks to the ability to heal and also bring Spotter and Spirits, plus whatever it is that you make Grace of the Land do. But it wouldn't be so good that a new elite spec has no place because Druid is always the best. There could be a situation where Druid is not always the best. I assume many people will disagree with this idea, but I would ask you, if you disagree with this, how do you suppose ANET is going to solve this? If they leave Druid as it is today, how will they design a new healing elite spec in the future that isn't power creeped or just immediately dead on arrival like Heal Ellie or Heal Rev? Obviously, if Druid remains as it is, even with 10-man spirits, how will it ever have competition from a new elite spec unless that elite spec is just insanely power creeped? So like I said, this isn't a huge problem today, and it probably won't even be a huge problem with the next X-Pack, especially if they buff spirits to 10 players, but it will be a problem for the long-term future, and I think it makes sense to deal with it now rather than deal with it 2 X-Packs from now. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I really do look forward to hearing your comments below.